Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Faye D'Souza. This is Live with Faye. We have one really cool judgment from the Supreme Court to sort of unpack, unbox, as we say, and take a look at, because it really, while it is about Pegasus, it's also about freedom of speech. It's also about the rights that journalists have to their sources. It's about your right to privacy as an ordinary citizen. It's about the government using national security as sort of an excuse to get away with a lot of things. And it's about our judiciary and our Supreme Court being really tough when it makes decisions, something that a lot of people had maybe sort of given up hope on. So I've got the perfect person to sort of break this down for us. Apar Gupta joins us right now. He's, the executive director of the Internet Freedom Foundation. Before we get started, though, I would request our audience who are watching this video to take a look at the work done by the Internet Freedom Foundation. It's the kind of organization that we should support as regular citizens if we can, because it effectively fights for your freedom. They're modern day freedom fighters. So specifically when it comes to privacy, when it comes to your rights in the internet, when it comes to your rights to data. So take a look at the work. I know that I rely very heavily on the work they do. So you might find it interesting, especially if you're someone who enjoys detail. So let me bring in Apar Gupta right now. Apar, thank you so much for giving us time. I know you've had a busy couple of days. Going step by step into, what that judgment meant. Yes. First of all, it was examinations of the allegations that the government was snooping on its own citizens. And the court very clearly firstly said that the government didn't explicitly deny anything. In your opinion, if you were to break that down for my audience, what do you think the biggest takeaways were from what the court said?
The biggest takeaway from this judgment is firstly considering the present climate in which there's a great degree of disenchantment with regard to any kind of institutions, not only the Supreme Court, whether it may be the Election Commission, it may be our parliament, where we say two basic trends. One, a very high degree of politicization or polarization, where these institutions can't act independently. And the second is when there is any kind of deprivation of fundamental rights or threats to a democracy, there is almost a non-response or there's a gridlock. So you don't see any measure of hope being signaled. So to me, this judgment through the constitution of a committee, which will report directly to the Supreme Court, is headed by a respected former Supreme Court judge with excellent credentials. Justice Ravindran has technical experts, gives a promise of accountability. So it signals hope, but it is not a cause of celebration because the report is not in front of us and accountability is not placed yet. What we have is a positive step in the right direction.
I'm going to take you one step away from the law into, the technicalities of Pegasus. What is this committee going to be looking for? Are they going to take the phones and check for traces of Pegasus, or are they going to be looking for a paper trail within government to see if someone authorized it? Is the government now obliged to share those paper trails? How will this investigation work?
So I would like to point out two things with respect to this committee. The first is who are the people there? There's of course a Supreme Court judge, Justice Ravindran, but his core committee constitutes of two people in addition to that. The first is Mr. Alok Joshi, who was a former head of the Intelligence Bureau, which is also an intelligence agency which conducts surveillance. So he knows the inner working and the departmental working. So he can get to know if the government actually purchased Pegasus and conducted the surveillance. And the second is a technical expert who's Dr. Sandeep Oberoi. He's also a cybersecurity expert. And in addition to that, if you look, there is a separate technical subcommittee also set up with several professors and academics, Faye, who are there from various faculties, including the IITs. Now, beyond the composition, that's one part, right? What is the actual mandate of the committee? The first is the procedure and process of the committee will be decided by the committee itself. So it has an ample amount of flexibility, but the court has asked and set a terms of reference. And this is again in two parts. The first is factual determinations. To inquire, investigate, and determine, this is in paragraph 61, that whether the Pegasus suite of software was used on phones. Two, details of the victims and persons affected by the spyware attacks. Third, what steps were taken by the government, if any, when the first revelations were made on November 1st, 2019 by the Indian Express, by Seema Chishti, when WhatsApp zero-click attacks were the case. And further, whether the government itself has purchased it. These are express questions which are noted. So this will be a factual determination. The second part of what the committee will then do is make recommendations regarding if laws need to be strengthened to protect individual privacy. How can we enhance our cybersecurity? So in terms of the process and next steps, this is what I anticipate much more practically. Just like the West Bengal committee, which is headed by Justice Lokur, which is also a separate process, I first expect a notice in a newspaper in which people and members of the public are invited to give submissions, as well as victims are invited. Specific notices are sent to them. And I think because of the technical capacity of this committee, it may also ask victims if they are comfortable to turn over mobile devices for forensic examination. So the fact of the Pegasus infection can be determined. And the second, much more important, is who did it, right? And for the who did it, I think this is where Mr. Alok Joshi's role becomes very, very important. And they can even examine witnesses and require their cooperation, including from the government. Now, how will this work out? I really don't know. But if you look at the order constituting the committee, specifically from paragraph 60 to the end of the judgment, the procedure is very clear. And I think it has ample power to actually provide a degree of clarity. If Pegasus infections happened, who caused it, and what should be the action taken? And then it goes back to the Supreme Court, this report. And the Supreme Court may then place actual accountability, issue directions, or also help improve our laws.
I want to ask you about a couple of things that we saw in the judgment. One, the Supreme Court rejecting the national security argument placed by the government and saying, hey, if you want to argue that this information, sharing this information will hamper national security, you have to tell us why, which the government was not able to do. Is that correct? What is the significance of that?
The significance of this is that the court has adopted a very measured and principled tone. So if you look at the conduct of the hearings, and which is noted in the judgment, when the petitions are first filed, the court does not issue notice, but it does call the government and it says whether you would like to file a reply. The government, through its law officer, says we need a copy of the petitions, and they're very voluminous. The court directs the petitioners to provide them a copy. After the government gets a copy, the court, through several hearings, urges the government to provide a counter affidavit or reply. One comes to be filed one day before the hearing. And it is a disappointing reply of 2 pages, which has general bold boilerplate statements that we deny each and everything, and makes generalized denials also, which is then substantiated in oral arguments through ad hominem attacks, which is again noted in the judgment, where the Solicitor General says the reports are motivated, etc., etc. The only annexure to the government's reply, which is called a limited affidavit, is a pre-existing speech made by the Ministry of Electronics and made by the Minister for the Ministry of Electronics and IT before Parliament on July 18th, 2021. So nothing new is given to the court. Now, what is the petitions? The petitions are not only PILs, they are also by aggrieved people, people who have been surveilled, people who are journalists, for instance, doing ground reporting in Jharkhand, like Ipsa Shakti or her husband Rupesh. And essentially, there is no denial whatsoever by the government. Now, the court is exasperated. It expresses it in the hearing and says that we can't force you to file an affidavit. We can't push you on national security, and please don't divulge anything on national security. But at the same point in time, if you're claiming national security as a ground not to respond specifically to them, please provide context. Please say how that national security will be undermined and respond to each petition individually. It can't be a blanket exemption. And here I would like to read 2 lines. The first line is with respect to when national security is with respect to the law of pleadings, because in law, each time I say ABC, the other party needs to say A is incorrect because of this, B is incorrect because of this. So the court essentially applauds the law of pleadings, which is a settled practice, and says that national security, quote unquote, cannot be a bugbear. And again, then thereafter states in a second quote, quote unquote, that mere invocation of national security by the state does not render the court a mute spectator. And the reason for this explained in the second paragraph of the judgment, where the court cites uh, uh, cites a line from Keshav Nand Bharti, specifically the opinion of Justice Khanna, who gave a dissenting opinion in ADM Jabalpur, a celebrated judge, to say that judicial review is necessary where there's mass deprivation of fundamental rights, including privacy. So quite correctly and firmly, the court's approach towards national security has been that we can't shut our eyes. We are the Supreme Court. If pleas are filed before us, we have to adjudicate them and perform our functional duty as the principal institution to defend the Constitution of India.
This also has implications on journalists and the privacy of every single citizen. Would you tell us what this judgment means for the right to privacy?
So, with respect to the right of privacy, there are certain passages in the judgment which first set out the right to privacy started out as a property right. A man's house is his castle. That kind of antiquated thinking that you can't cause search seizures and barge into somebody's private residence and demand whatever you want to know without reasonable suspicion, without a legal framework, and that kind of search needs to be proportional. But our privacy understanding has advanced tremendously, Faye, with the Puttaswamy judgment in 2017, which links privacy to each one of our fundamental rights, which includes the fundamental right to freedom of speech and expression. People will ask, how does privacy link to our freedom of speech and expression? Quite immediately. If we know we are under surveillance, especially by invasive software such as Pegasus, which can infiltrate our phone, take root access, get to know all our pictures, conversations, photographs, screen shares, etc., 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 we'll be much more careful. We won't do the kind of things, have the kind of conversations that we would like. We won't even possibly have the kind of thoughts we would like to have, right? Where we search Google to confirm something or the other. So it causes a very severe behavioral modification. And especially if the government is doing it, you are much more scared because the government has the power of police, of detention, etc., so much. Now, with respect to journalists, which have been the focal targets of surveillance, especially with respect to the Pegasus disclosures in India, I think the court has specifically stated that when your freedom of speech is impacted for journalists, it undermines a journalist's ability to freely talk to their sources. So, for instance, how will a journalist have a conversation with a person, let's say, in a small rural district? Given that our rule of law framework is far from ideal, their integrity of their sources as well as of that conversation will be compromised. In a way, the court has expressly recognized that journalists have been impacted, but after that, it stretches it much beyond Faye. If you look at the judgment and says it impacts every other person as well. It impacts the members of the general public.
Right. And fundamentally, coming back, to the Supreme Court judgment and the voice or the tone that was used here very clearly, is it different from what you have seen from the Supreme Court recently? And we've seen the government do this sealed envelope thing in the past, this national security thing in the past. The government actually did not answer the questions on Pegasus adequately inside of Parliament and then refused to answer those questions in court as well. Does this for you, mean that there's maybe a turn of events at this point?
Faye, once I was in court and I heard a very good phrase by a very noted constitutional lawyer, an expert in public law, as well as a brilliant academic, Mr. Arvind Attar. He said that there is a constitutional climate, there's an environment also in which the law operates. And I think that puts this very, very clearly. Because there, as I said in my initial remarks, there's been a level of disenchantment where public expectation with respect to what's there in terms of our constitutional framework is not being fulfilled in terms of verdict from the Supreme Court. For instance, if you look at Siddiq Kapan's bail, right, something which should be granted, liberty which should be provided, or you look at the Aryan Khan verdict today, in which without possession or consumption, a person has had to spend 22 days in jail and then has had to deploy the best advocates in this country, the best legal representation possible, who flies in from Delhi, right? So public expectation in our courts with respect to not day to day, but even with respect to large constitutional cases has been falling, especially for constitutional scholars. Some of my colleagues like Gautam, Surya, Vrinda have written about it. They have expressed disappointment. Chintan Chandrachud, with respect to the internet shutdown judgment, has also expressed disappointment. So it's not as if there is a lack of basis or rigor in the analysis that people are disappointed with the court. It comes both from popular sentiment as well as a certain degree of rigor and analysis. Now, in this constitutional climate, we are looking at an incremental improvement through this judgment, which starts by a quote by George Orwell in 1984 itself, that if you want to keep a secret, you must hide it from yourself, right? And that is the theme of 1984 is a dystopian state in which it is watching everything, and the court has been fairly alive to it. And through three specific features beyond the invocation of such language, it has taken a firm decision. First, it asks for transparency. It rejects the claim by the government that we are not obliged to provide certain information to the court. Secondly, it makes specific observations on the claim of national security, which can sometimes overawe the court in terms of a deference towards the union executive. Third, it rejects the express suggestion at the fag end of the hearings, which is also noted in the judgment by the government, that it will set up its own committee. And here it notes two things. One, it says there's a reasonable apprehension by the petitioners that given Pegasus can only be sold to governments, Faye, that maybe an Indian state agency has purchased it. And because we have to ensure that there is confidence in these petitioners, we cannot go ahead and suggest that the government can itself set up its own committee. Hence, we are setting up a different committee by itself, which will be independent and will be empowered to conduct a comprehensive investigation, factual, and then make recommendations which are legal. So I would say the judgment, both in terms of its phrasing, its articulation, its legal basis, coming in the present constitutional climate, improves it.
Thank you, Apar. That's really important and heartening, I think, for all of our viewers as a takeaway, the fact that the Supreme Court put out a very strongly worded judgment from a 3-judge bench saying that Pegasus is something that needs to be looked into, that the Supreme Court themselves handpicked the people who will look into it. It did not pass it on to the government saying, you pick whoever you want. It made sure that it handpicked people, and it took its time to do so, which was also interesting. Yes. It did not buy the argument that national security trumps all and national security is enough as as a justification. And it also placed a fair amount of importance on the privacy of individual citizens, something that has not been taken seriously by our government ever, actually. It's not just this government, even previous government.
No, that is correct.
It's never been taken seriously. So it's a good thing to hear the Supreme Court actually. And the last time we heard something like this was during the Aadhaar judgment, where the Supreme Court placed a certain amount of importance in the privacy of ordinary citizens. It's nice to see that actually being implemented as well. So we'll have to watch and see what that report looks like and what it leads to. But it's a step in the right direction, and it's something that should give us faith that has not been very easy to come by in recent times. So it's a good thing that we've had this judgment now. Apar Gupta of the Internet Freedom Foundation, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Faye. Thank you.
Thank you. For our viewers, the news will be up at exactly 9 o'clock. Do take a look at it.